The hum of the servers was a constant, low thrum against my eardrums, a familiar lullaby in the cavernous main chamber of the Deep Space Observatory. My chair creaked as I leaned forward, elbows on the cold, laminated desk, my gaze fixed on the array of monitors that glowed with the distant, silent ballet of the cosmos. Outside, the world was asleep, blanketed in the kind of profound darkness that only truly exists far from city lights. Under a sky so thick with stars it felt like velvet. I was sifting through routine background radiation, the usual cosmic noise when it appeared. Not on the primary spectral analysis, not in the expected radio frequencies, but buried deep in a tertiary wavelet decomposition, a statistical anomaly that shouldn't have been there. It pulsed, a faint, almost imperceptible flicker against the baseline, a rhythm that was no rhythm at all. A stray particle, a data spike. A glitch in the aging hardware. I'd seen it all before. I ran the diagnostic protocols. Clean. Every subsystem reported optimal function. I recalibrated the filters, adjusted the gain, even rebooted the primary processing unit. The flicker persisted, subtle but stubborn, like a phantom itch I couldn't quite scratch. It wasn't strong, not a burst or a flare, but a continuous, intricate pattern, too complex to be random. It was a signal from nothing. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a sudden, unwelcome drumbeat. This couldn't be right. Logic screamed at me, insisting on mundane explanations. I told myself it was just a new type of cosmic interference, something previously uncatalogued, perhaps an echo from a distant, violent event that had traveled light years to reach us. I dismissed it, filed it mentally under curiosity, and pushed it aside, attempting to refocus on the more pressing task of mapping a newly discovered exoplanet candidate. But the image of that faint, impossible pulse kept superimposing itself over the bright, familiar star fields. I tried to ignore it, to busy myself with the comforting routine of data analysis, the predictable ebb and flow of galactic dynamics. The air in the chamber felt suddenly heavier, charged with an unidentifiable tension. I caught myself glancing at the anomaly's coordinates again, the numbers etched into my memory. A region of space so utterly barren, a place where no known physical process could generate such a sustained, structured output. It was an affront to everything I understood. The next morning, I drove my car to the mechanic shop. The engine had been making a strange, rattling sound for weeks, a persistent, low-grade irritation that mirrored the one the signal had started in my mind. The mechanic, a burly individual with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, grunted a greeting as I pulled in. The air in the shop was thick with the scent of oil, exhaust fumes, and something else, something metallic and sharp that made my nose prickle. My car was already on a lift, not broken, just getting a routine checkup, its underbelly exposed to the harsh fluorescent lights. The sounds of the shop, the clang of tools, the whir of the air compressor, the distant chatter of the mechanic talking to a colleague did little to ground me. My mind kept replaying the data, the faint, impossible signature. The mechanic called out asking about the rattling, but my answer was vague, distracted. I just needed it checked. Everything. He gave me a puzzled look, then shrugged, turning back to another vehicle. I walked around my own car, tracing the lines of the fender with my finger, feeling the cool, smooth metal. The mundane reality of the shop, the tangible grit and grime, felt like a thin veil, barely concealing the cosmic question that now consumed me. How could something be there where absolutely nothing should exist, deeper? I pulled up the log data from the night before, my fingers hesitant on the keyboard. The anomaly was still there, a thin, wavering line on the spectral graph, utterly defiant. I zoomed in, then in further, until the individual components of the signal became visible. It wasn't a simple pulse. It was a tapestry, intricate and non-repeating, a pattern that shifted and evolved with each passing moment, yet maintained an underlying coherence. It was like watching a complex alien language unfold, one character at a time, each unique, yet undeniably part of a larger, terrifyingly deliberate whole. My breath hitched. This wasn't noise. This wasn't a malfunction. This was communication, but from what? And why from the absolute emptiness between galaxies? My chair creaked as I leaned forward, elbows on the cold, laminated desk, my gaze fixed on the array of monitors that glowed with the distant, silent whisper I'd stumbled upon. For hours now, the initial shock had faded, replaced by a meticulous, almost desperate need to categorize it, to force it into a known box. It had to be an instrumental error, a glitch, some cosmic noise that had fooled the filters. My fingers danced across the keyboard, calling up diagnostics, running filters, cross-referencing against known celestial phenomena. The screens shifted, displaying waveforms, spectral analyzes, energy signatures. Each new visualization only deepened the knot in my stomach. The signal wasn't just there, it was impossibly clean, cutting through the background radiation like a surgeon's scalpel. Its periodicity defied every known astrophysical process. No pulsar spun with such intricate timing, no black hole merger produced such a precise, repeating signature. I tried to apply standard communication protocols, assuming some advanced but comprehensible form of encoding. Nothing, only chaotic static when I tried to decode it, yet the raw pattern itself was anything but chaotic. It was structured, layered, a symphony of impossible frequencies. My temples began to throb with a dull ache. What was I looking at? Doubt gnawed at me. My colleague, the chief engineer, had always dismissed my theories on deep void anomalies. Just cosmic background, Raj, he'd say, or faulty sensors. But this wasn't background, this wasn't faulty. The data was too robust, too consistent. I pulled up the raw data stream again, letting the patterns scroll across the screen, a mesmerizing dance of peaks and troughs. My eyes, gritty from lack of sleep, traced the lines. A segment repeated, then another subtly different yet echoing the first. A motif, a theme. It was like looking at sheet music written in a language I couldn't read, but instinctively knowing it wasn't random scribbles, it was deliberate. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't noise. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. This was intelligence, alien, ancient, and utterly, terrifyingly incomprehensible. Breath hitched. The air in the chamber, usually smelling faintly of ozone and dust, suddenly tasted metallic like fear. This wasn't a discovery, it was an encounter. With what? Later that week, I found myself in the bright, oil-scented air of the mechanic shop, my car already on the lift, not broken. I'd brought it in for a routine checkup, a pathetic attempt at normalcy. The overhead fluorescence hummed, a different kind of thrum than the servers, but no less constant. The floor, stained with years of grease and grime, felt solid beneath my worn boots. A young mechanic, his hands smudged with oil, peered under the chassis. "Looks good, Raj," he grunted, the clang of a wrench against metal echoing in the bay. "Just needed the usual. Filters are clean." I nodded, pretending to listen, my gaze fixed on the underside of my sedan. The smell of hot engine oil and exhaust fumes filled my nostrils, a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled air of the observatory. My mind, however, was miles away, replaying the signal's impossible patterns. I felt a strange detachment, as if my body was merely a puppet going through the motions of everyday life, while my true self remained tethered to the screens back at my workstation. The mechanic spoke again, something about tire rotation, but the words blurred, lost in the persistent echo of the signal in my head. I felt a sudden, intense urge to be back there, to delve deeper, to understand. This mundane world felt thin, translucent, easily torn. Back at the observatory, the isolation became self-imposed. I started arriving before anyone, leaving long after the last colleague had departed. The chief engineer tried to engage me in conversation about new budget allocations. I mumbled vague answers, my eyes already darting back to the monitors. A junior researcher asked about my latest project. I deflected, claiming proprietary data. The truth was, I couldn't explain it, not yet. How could I articulate a signal that defied physics? A message from nothing? Sleep became a luxury, food a secondary thought. My beard grew a rough stubble against my jaw. My clothes felt stale. The signal was everything. I began to categorize its patterns, not by frequency or amplitude, but by what I could only describe as texture or intent. There were segments that felt like a question, others like a statement, and some that were just vast, indifferent. The more I immersed myself, the more it seemed to subtly shift, revealing new layers of complexity as if acknowledging my scrutiny. Not a direct response, not a dialogue, but a deepening of its own mystery, a pulling back of another veil. What kind of mind would communicate like this, and what would happen when I finally understood its true message? G-pull, a cold, unsettling current beneath my skin. It was still there, the signal always there. The mechanic, a burly man with grease-stained hands and a faded band t-shirt, cleared his throat above me. "Raj, you hear me? Radiator's fine, fluid levels good, no issues. He gave the tire a perfunctory slap. She's good to go. Just a routine check, right? Right, I mumbled, pushing myself up from the oily concrete floor of the mechanic shop, my car already on lift, not broken. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, a dry, buzzing sound that usually blended into the background. Now, though, it seemed to vibrate with an unnerving resonance, almost a discordant harmony with the faint, impossible rhythm in my head. The air, thick with the smell of old oil and gasoline, felt heavy. I wiped a smudge of grime from my cheek, my gaze still drifting to the lift, the skeletal underside of my sedan. No issues, he said, but my own internal diagnostics was screaming otherwise. I paid the mechanic, his voice seeming to warp around the edges, a subtle echo that made me second-guess if I'd heard him correctly. I shook my head, blaming fatigue. The engine turned over with its usual growl, a comforting, familiar sound, yet even that felt off, like a recording played a fraction of a second too slow. As I pulled out of the bay and onto the street, the car's radio flickered. Static, sharp and sudden, drowned out the talk show host. I hit the dashboard, nothing, just the hiss. Then, as abruptly as it began, it cleared, the host's voice returning, talking about local traffic. My hands tightened on the wheel. A glitch, just a glitch, old car. The drive home was a blur of unease. Streetlights seemed to pulse, their yellow glow momentarily sharpening, then dimming. The reflections in shop windows warped, stretching familiar shapes into elongated, unfamiliar shadows. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. My vision swam. For a split second, the outline of a distant building seemed to shimmer, its solid form dissolving into a pattern of intricate, impossible angles, like fractals spun from a forgotten geometry. Then it was gone, replaced by the mundane brick and mortar. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I knew what I saw, even if my brain refused to process it. Back in the quiet solitude of my apartment, the air was cool, stale. My computer, usually a silent sentinel, emitted a low, almost imperceptible hum, a mechanical heartbeat that felt irregular. I moved to my desk, the stack of research papers and printouts a familiar sight. I needed to focus. I needed to understand what was happening, both to the signal and to me. I poured myself a mug of lukewarm coffee, the metallic taste of fear coating my tongue, making the bitter liquid almost palatable. I pulled up the visualization software for the signal again, the intricate patterns swirling across the screen, a dance of impossible complexity. As I watched, a single pixel at the edge of my monitor flickered, then another spreading like a disease across the display. My breath caught. I smacked the side of the monitor. It came back on with a sudden, blinding flash, the signal patterns now distorted, stretched, as if viewed through warped glass. I stared, my fingers trembling above the keyboard. It was reacting, it was responding. I pushed away from the computer, a new, desperate energy seizing me. The signal wasn't just data, it was something else, something active. I needed to look beyond astrophysics, beyond what I knew. I delved into the digital archives of ancient history, forgotten languages, esoteric philosophy. Hours bled into one another. The smell of dust, imagined or real, began to permeate the air around me. My eyes burned, tracing lines of text on brittle, digitized parchment. Deep within a collection of obscure historical texts, buried under layers of academic footnotes and forgotten translations, I found it. A reference, not to a signal, not directly. They called these periods the Great Trembling. My skin prickled, aware. I scrolled through more pages, finding similar, unsettling accounts. Mentions of strange lights in the sky that weren't stars, of impossible geometries appearing in dreams. The texts spoke of these individuals being drawn to desolate places, to gates where the veil between worlds was thin. As I read, the low hum from my computer intensified, no longer irregular, but a steady, deep thrum that vibrated through the floorboards, through the very chair I sat on. It wasn't the computer. It was deeper, resonating in my bones. I looked up, my gaze sweeping the room. I gasped, pushing away from the desk, sending my chair scraping across the floor. My heart hammered against my ribs. The hum intensified, a physical pressure against my eardrums. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. It was inside my head now. The room felt like it was expanding, stretching, the walls breathing. This growing, impossible presence. Right, I mumbled, pushing myself up from the oily concrete floor of the mechanic shop, my car already on lift. Not broken. Now, though, it seemed to vibrate with an unnerving resonance, almost a low thrum that burrowed behind my ears. I rubbed my temples, trying to shake off the lingering disorientation from the fall. My palm came away slick with grease and a fine, gritty dust that seemed to cling to everything in this place. The air here was a stale mixture of exhaust fumes, old oil, and something else, something metallic and sharp that tightened my throat. The mechanic, a burly man with a grease-stained uniform and a perpetually furrowed brow, glanced over from where he was tightening a bolt on my car's underside. The car itself hung suspended, a dark, heavy silhouette against the bright work lights. "You all right there, Chief? Looked like you tripped over your own feet." His voice was gruff, but held a hint of concern. I nodded, though the simple motion sent a dull ache through my skull. My vision swam for a split second. The stark white walls of the mechanic shop seemed to ripple, the rigid lines of the shelving units wavering like heat haze. For a moment, the concrete floor beneath my feet felt less solid, more like a shifting current. A fleeting glimpse of something vast and dark, a geometry that made no sense, flashed at the very edge of my perception, then was gone. "Just tired," I managed, my voice rougher than I intended. The mechanic shrugged, returning his attention to the car. "Long nights happens, sleep. Yes, that was it. My mind, overloaded with the signal, was playing tricks. The shimmering, the odd scent, just exhaustion. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. The mechanic shop was back to its dull, predictable reality. The greasy scent of oil was strong, comforting in its familiarity. I just needed to get home. What else could it be? The quiet of my apartment was usually a balm, a sanctuary where I could retreat into the abstract beauty of the cosmos without interruption. I brewed a strong pot of coffee, the aroma of roasted beans a grounding presence in the air, but even that couldn't quite chase away the lingering unease. I tried to focus on an academic paper, but the words blurred, meaningless. My mind kept replaying that brief, impossible flicker in the mechanic shop, the sense of something immense just out of sight. I needed sleep, real sleep. To reset, I finally collapsed into bed, the mattress sighing under my weight. The sheets were cool against my skin. I closed my eyes, seeking oblivion, but oblivion did not come. Instead, the signal found me. It wasn't a dream in the conventional sense. It was a plunge. I was no longer in my bed. Lines converged where they shouldn't, planes folded into themselves, and angles twisted into paradoxes. The colors were wrong. Hues that bled into each other in ways my eyes couldn't process, vibrating with an internal light. A sound began to grow, not from any discernible direction, but from everywhere at once. It was a hum, vast and deep, like the fundamental frequency of a universe that had never known stars or planets, only raw ancient thought. It resonated in my bones, a vibration so profound it felt like my very atoms were being rearranged. A pressure built behind my eyes, as if an invisible force was trying to push through the back of my skull. It wasn't pain, not exactly, but an unbearable awareness. I smelled ozone, sharp and clean, mixed with something else, a scent like petrified dust, millennia old, carrying the weight of eons. And then a presence, not seen but felt. It was enormous, incomprehensibly so, a vastness that dwarfed galaxies. It wasn't a living being as I understood it. It was a concept, a fundamental constant of reality, woven from the fabric of the impossible geometries around me. It was there, and it was aware of me, of everything. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the cosmic hum. My skin prickled, every nerve ending screaming a silent warning. I was nothing before it, a speck, less than a speck. The dream wasn't showing me a vision, it was downloading an experience directly into my consciousness. I fought, thrashing against the unseen current, desperate to return to the simple, comprehensible world of my bedroom. I woke with a choked gasp, bolt upright, sheets tangled around my legs. My body was slick with sweat, my breath ragged. My room felt alien, the familiar furniture distorted by the afterglow of the impossible vision. My hands trembled as I reached for the glass of water on my bedside table, the cool ceramic, a small comfort. The taste of metallic fear still lingered on my tongue. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was too vivid, too sensory. The geometries, the hum, the crushing pressure of that ancient presence, it had felt real. Had I truly been there? Or had it been here inside my head? The next morning, the world felt thin, translucent. I moved through my apartment like a ghost, the mundane tasks of making coffee and toast feeling strangely theatrical. The smell of coffee was weak, the taste bland. I tried to convince myself it was just a severe case of sleep deprivation, my mind playing tricks. But then, as I stared at the chipped rim of my coffee mug, the ceramic seemed to shimmer. The solid brown surface rippled, and for a fleeting instant, I saw not a mug, but a complex, multifaceted object, shifting and reforming with impossible angles, reflecting light from a source that didn't exist. My grip tightened on the mug, my grip tight. This wasn't just dreams anymore. This was happening in broad daylight in my own home. The memory of the mechanic shop incident returned, sharper now, less dismissible. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was the signal. It was breaking through. My mind, my perception, it was being altered, warped. There was this what understanding the signal truly meant. To have it rewrite the very fabric of my reality. What if it wasn't just my mind that was breaking? I needed answers. I needed to get back to the lab, to the equipment, to the raw data. Perhaps there was something I'd missed, some frequency, some pattern that explained this intrusion. I dressed quickly, my movements jerky, fueled by a panicked urgency. The short walk to the lab felt longer than usual, the familiar city streets seeming slightly off-kilter, the buildings leaning in just a fraction too much. I hurried through the quiet corridors, the fluorescent lights humming above, a sound that now carried a faint, unsettling echo of the cosmic hum from my dream. In the controlled environment of my lab, surrounded by familiar screens and blinking lights, I felt a momentary sense of security. This was my domain. This was reality. The abstract patterns, the shimmering waveforms filled the screen. As I zoomed in, adjusting the filters, the lines on the display seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, a subtle luminescence that wasn't part of the monitor's display. I put on my specialized headphones, isolating the raw audio. The signal, usually a complex, layered static, now seemed to carry a faint, rhythmic thrum beneath the surface, a deep, resonant vibration that I felt in my chest, a physical pressure. It was the hum. My fingers hovered over the controls, a tremor running through my arm. It was a direct conduit, a channel flowing not just into my equipment, but into my very being. The patterns on the screen seemed to deepen, to take on a three-dimensional quality, as if I could reach out and touch the impossible angles they suggested. It was there, a presence implied by absence, a space where light itself seemed to bend away. The signal was not merely observed, it was experienced. What did that mean for me? If my own mind was becoming the receiver, what would be left when it was done? Right, I mumbled, pushing myself up from the oily concrete floor of the mechanic shop. Your car already on lift, not broken. A low thrum that sank into my bones. My head throbbed. The smell of grease and stale exhaust fumes hung heavy, a familiar scent made oppressive, clinging to my clothes, my hair. The mechanic, a hulking figure with hands like wrenches, just grunted from beneath my car, his voice muffled by the metal. My car, it wasn't broken, just there, on the lift. It had been there for hours, an inexplicable wait for a non-existent repair. Why hadn't I just left? A strange inertia held me, a lingering sense of being watched, of needing to stay put, to not draw attention. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a dull drumbeat against the silence that stretched between the mechanic's occasional clank and the persistent hum of the lights. Fatigue, that was all it was, just fatigue. I had to share this. It demanded explanation, demanded peer review. Even if my own perception felt like it was fracturing. Leaving the mechanic shop, your car already on lift, not broken, felt like breaking a spell. The sudden rush of cool night air on my face, a shock after the claustrophobic warmth of the garage. I drove home, the familiar streets alien under the streetlights, my mind racing, preparing for the inevitable skepticism. My presentation was scheduled for the next morning. I'd spent the night hunched over my monitor, refining the data, trying to find a way to articulate the ineffable. I walked into the lecture hall, the scent of stale coffee and nervous anticipation thick in the air. My colleagues were there, a scattering of familiar faces, some looking curious, others openly skeptical even before I'd begun. A senior colleague sat front and center, his expression unreadable. I started with the raw data, the anomalous energy signatures, the impossible complexity. My voice at first, steady, professional, I showed the charts, the graphs, the spectral analysis that defied every known astrophysical model. My words became less precise, more desperate. My hands trembled slightly as I gestured at the projections, my throat dry, a metallic fear coating my tongue. A cough broke the tension. Raj, the senior colleague, began, his voice calm, almost too calm. Are I suggesting an intelligent, non-terrestrial entity? A colleague in the back shifted uncomfortably. My carefully constructed arguments dissolved under their gaze. I saw their faces, a mixture of pity and professional distaste. They saw a man unraveling, not a discovery. I left the hall, the weight of their disbelief pressing on me like a physical force. I retreated to my office, the fluorescent bulbs flickering, casting the hallway in sickly green intervals. I tried calling a few trusted researchers, those who had always been open to radical ideas. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. Emails bounced back or were met with terse, polite refusals. Intriguing, Raj, but perhaps you should take a sabbatical. The department head is concerned about your recent focus. The words were always carefully chosen, but the message was clear. I was being shut down. Ice flooded my veins. My own department head eventually called me in, his face etched with a weary concern. He spoke of stress, of overwork, of the importance of mental well-being. He didn't dismiss my work outright, not in so many words, but the implication was stark. My career, my reputation was on the line. He gently suggested a temporary leave. It was a polite dismissal, a soft banishment. The signal, meanwhile, continued its silent broadcast, its subtle pressure growing, a constant, low thrum against my sanity, felt only by me. It was a cruel irony. The more I understood, the more alone I became. Conventional science had closed its doors. I was an outcast, my observations dismissed as delusion. But the signal persisted, unwavering, demanding answers. They lay elsewhere. I started scouring old texts, obscure digital archives, forgotten manuscripts that hinted at forbidden knowledge. I spent days in the dusty, quiet corners of the university library, the smell of aged paper and forgotten wisdom filling my lungs. My fingers brushed against brittle pages, tracing archaic symbols and faded script. And then I found it. It was a fragmented manuscript, tucked away in a collection of ancient astronomical observations, dismissed as astrological nonsense. The way it spoke of minds fracturing, of the universe revealing its true, hideous face to those who listened too long. My skin prickled, aware. I stared at the faded ink, the archaic symbols blurring before my eyes. This wasn't some abstract cosmic phenomenon I was dealing with. This was something ancient, something that had been known, perhaps, to terrified minds long before telescopes ever pierced the night sky. The manuscript ended abruptly, a page torn, leaving only a single horrifying question scribbled in a different, more recent hand. What happens when it wakes? Right, I mumbled, pushing myself up from the oily concrete floor of the mechanic shop, my car already on lift. Not broken, now though it seemed to vibrate with an unnerving resonance, almost a low growl beneath the usual mechanical din. My hands were slick with a thin film of something I didn't want to identify, and the cold from the concrete had seeped into my bones. The air smelled of burnt oil, stale exhaust, and something else, a faint, metallic tang that made my tongue feel thick. My car, perfectly fine, sat suspended above me, a silent, mocking testament to my distraction. I hadn't meant to fall asleep here or even linger. I'd driven in, mind buzzing with the signal, convinced the car was making a noise it wasn't, just to have a reason to get out, to move. The mechanic, a burly man with grease permanently etched into his fingernails, had just shaken his head, told me to get some rest. But rest felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, a weakness that would let the signal slip further from my grasp. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs intensified, a throbbing in the back of my skull. It felt like the entire world was vibrating on the same frequency as the void. What if the signal wasn't just out there? My apartment, usually a sanctuary of ordered chaos, felt like a cage when I finally got there. I barely registered the familiar scent of old paper and brewing coffee, my senses overwhelmed by a phantom metallic taste, like old blood. My lab, a corner of my living room overflowing with repurposed equipment, was where I truly belonged. The signal was waiting. I had been feeding new algorithms into the processor for hours before I'd left, a desperate attempt to find a pattern, any pattern, in the chaotic energy bursts. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a manic energy coursing through me. I ignored the ache in my shoulders, the grit in my eyes. The algorithms were running, sifting, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. It wasn't a language in any known sense. No syntax, no grammar, just raw, unfiltered data. My mind felt stretched thin like a membrane pulled taut over something vast and unknown. Then a flicker, not a pattern, not a code, but a resonance, a feedback loop. It was as if the signal wasn't meant to be read, but to be felt. My breath hitched. I adjusted the parameters, not searching for linguistic structures, but for conceptual nodes, for direct energetic transfers. The screen pulsed. The lines on the display began to coalesce, not into words, but into abstract forms, shapes, ideas. My vision blurred for a moment, the room seeming to tilt. The hum of my equipment deepened, a low thrum that vibrated through the floorboards, up into my chair, into my very teeth. It was no longer an external sound. It was inside me. Then it hit, not a translation, but a direct download. A flood of raw, unmediated understanding slammed into my consciousness. It was like having 1,000 years of history, philosophy, and astronomical data shoved into my skull at once, but none of it was human. The first concept that solidified, that burned itself into my mind, was scale. Not just large, but truly, utterly, mind-bendingly vast. The cosmos I knew, the galaxies and clusters, were merely dust motes in an ocean of something else. Something older, something that dwarfed existence. My hands trembled. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. My own breath hitched, ragged and shallow. The next concept, indifference. The universe didn't care. It wasn't hostile, it simply had no capacity for such a concept. Humanity was less than an ant, less than a single atom in a storm of incomprehensible forces. Nausea twisted through me, a bitter, metallic taste coating my tongue. Then came the third, the most terrifying concept of all, sleep. Not the sleep of rest, but of ancient, unimaginable entities, vast slumbering intelligences whose waking would redefine reality itself. Our perception of space, time, matter, all of it, a flimsy construct over a truth too immense to bear. My skin prickled, aware of every hair on my arms standing on end. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to dim, then brighten, then dim again, a sickly yellow pulse mirroring the agony in my head. I tried to pull away, to break the connection, to shut down the system, but my fingers wouldn't obey. They hovered, paralyzed, above the keys. The information wasn't coming from the screen anymore. It was coming through me, a direct conduit. My mind was no longer my own. I saw faint, shifting geometries at the edge of my vision, impossible angles that defied Euclidean space. The familiar posters on my wall, the stacks of books, all seemed to subtly warp, their edges softening, their colors bleeding. This wasn't just data. It was an infection, a transformation. What else was waiting to be understood, to be absorbed? A low thrum beneath the audible buzz. My head throbbed, a dull ache behind my eyes that had become a constant companion these last few weeks. Sleep, when it came, was a fractured thing, riddled with images that felt less like dreams and more like echoes of the signal, twisting the familiar into something alien. My eyes felt gritty, heavy, like fine sand had been rubbed beneath the lids. I blinked, trying to clear the haze, but it persisted. The air in the mechanic shop, my car already on lift, not broken, hung thick with the scent of old oil, exhaust fumes, and something else, a faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place, but which had started to follow me everywhere. As I looked at the concrete floor, a hairline crack, thin as a spider silk, seemed to pulse faintly, almost imperceptibly, with a dull internal light. It wasn't a trick of the flickering bulb. I stared, unblinking, and the faint, rhythmic glow continued, a slow, deep breath. A shadow detached itself from the wall beside the lift, stretching, elongating, then snapping back into place as a mechanic, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, approached. "All done, Raj," he said, his voice a normal, mundane sound that felt distant, as if filtered through layers of thick glass. Just a loose connection, nothing major. He gestured vaguely at the underside of my car. I nodded, but my gaze lingered on the shadow he'd cast. For a split second, it hadn't just moved. It had twisted, pulling away from his form in a way that defied the angle of the light, like a separate, living entity before snapping back into its expected shape. What did he see? I paid the mechanic, his words about the bill and future maintenance washing over me like an inconsequential tide. My fingers, as I handed over the worn bills, felt strangely numb, disconnected. He offered a small, friendly smile, but his expression seemed to warp, just for a moment, the corners of his mouth stretching too wide, his eyes sinking too deep, like a poorly rendered photograph before snapping back to normal. My own face, I knew, must have been a mask of exhaustion, my eyes probably sunken, pupils dilated from the constant strain. I just hoped my detachment wasn't obvious. I drove away, the mundane world receding, leaving me alone with the growing conviction that the signal wasn't just informing me, it was changing me. I hadn't slept properly in days. A sparse stubble covered my jaw. The scent of stale coffee and unwashed clothes clung to me, but beneath it, that faint, metallic tang persisted. The deciphered data swam across my main screen, a constant stream of alien syntax that I no longer needed to actively translate. It had become instinctual, a new language woven directly into the fabric of my thoughts. I ran a hand over the rough metal casing of the primary receiver. I could feel a faint vibration, not from the machinery, but deeper, resonating in my bones. I leaned closer to the screen, focusing on the shifting patterns. The data wasn't just lines of code, it was a window, but then the room itself began to shift. The straight lines of the wall panels seemed to subtly curve, just at the periphery of my vision. It wasn't my eyes playing tricks. It felt like the very architecture of reality was stretching, breathing. A colleague's face, pale and worried, appeared on my video comms. "Raj, I there. We haven't heard from everything all right?" His voice was tinny, far away. I stared at his image. The light behind him in his own office seemed to ripple, distorting the edges of his head, making his features momentarily blur like heat haze off asphalt. His right eye, for a brief second, appeared to bulge, distended and glassy before snapping back to normal. I felt no surprise, no immediate fear, only a profound, unsettling curiosity. "I'm fine," I said. My voice hoarse, a stranger's voice. "Just busy." My colleague frowned, his concern evident even through the distorted screen. "I look exhausted, Raj. Are I eating, sleeping?" He paused. "I know the team's been talking. Maybe I need a break." A break. The word felt meaningless, an archaic concept from a world I was rapidly leaving behind. The world he inhabited, with its mundane worries about sleep and food, seemed utterly irrelevant. The distortions around his image flickered again, more pronounced this time, the entire frame wavering as if viewed through turbulent water. I ended the call without another word, cutting him off mid-sentence. He would be concerned, perhaps even angry. I didn't care. His reality was no longer mine. The constant hum in my skull intensified, morphing into a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the metal floor and up into my chair. The air in the bunker tasted metallic, like copper and ozone, a taste that was both repulsive and strangely familiar. The entire room seemed to breathe around me, the walls subtly expanding and contracting, the corners softening into impossible curves before snapping back into sharp angles. Then, the static on a nearby, unused monitor flared, not with random noise, but with definite patterns. Shapes. Not geometric, not organic, but something in between, shifting, writhing. They were the same impossible forms described by the signal, now manifesting in the very fabric of my immediate environment. It was like peeling back a veil, seeing the true nature of things beneath the thin veneer of human perception. Was this what the signal intended? Was it merely showing me the world as it truly was, or was it actively remaking it, starting with me? Most as if the very air in the mechanic shop, my car already on lift, not broken, was vibrating with an unheard, impossible frequency. I had no idea what it was, but it made the oily concrete floor beneath my palms feel like it was moving. I pushed myself fully upright, my muscles stiff, and the humming intensified, a dry rasp that seemed to settle in my teeth. The shop itself, usually a chaotic symphony of air wrenches and clanging metal, felt unnervingly quiet, save for that insistent drone. My car, still perched on its lift, looked alien, a silent metal carcass suspended in the sickly yellow glow of the overhead fluorescence. I could taste the stale, metallic tang of the air, thick with exhaust and something else, something cold and ancient like deep space itself. A colleague, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, glanced my way. "Everything all right, Raj? You look like you've seen a ghost." His voice sounded distant, muffled, as if filtered through carton. I just nodded, trying to force a smile, but my jaw felt locked. The signal, the impossible hum, wasn't just in the shop's fluorescent lights. It was in me, a persistent vibration behind my eyes, a silent thrum in my bones. It felt like a vast, empty space was reaching out. I mumbled something about needing to get back to my own work, ignoring his raised eyebrow. The car wasn't even broken, just a routine checkup. But the signal had pulled me here, hadn't it? A frantic urge to return to my instruments, to the data, clawed at me. This wasn't just an observation anymore. It was a direct, personal summons, a call. What if the signal wasn't just data, but a direct communication meant for me? Back in the abandoned factory I'd repurposed as my lab, the familiar scent of ozone and dust filled my nostrils, but it was overlaid with something new, something indefinable. The place felt different, charged. My instruments, usually a comforting array of blinking lights and silent screens, now seemed to pulse with an inner life. The air throbbed with a low, inaudible resonance, a deep, pervasive hum that I felt more than heard. It was the signal, stronger here, more insistent, a gravitational pull on my very thoughts. I stared at the readouts, the chaotic, beautiful patterns that defied all logic. They twisted, reformed, hinted at structures too vast to comprehend, yet within them I saw a new order. It wasn't random. It wasn't background noise. It was a language not of words but of pure abstract intent. It had a rhythm, a will. It felt like the universe itself was slowly turning its impossibly ancient gaze upon me, and I was being singled out. My hands trembled as I reached for the console. This was a beckoning, a lure. It wasn't asking for analysis, it was demanding a response. The realization settled in my gut, a cold, heavy stone. I wasn't just studying an anomaly, I was being drawn into it. I had to go deeper to understand the nature of this summons, to see where it led. What would happen if I truly answered it, not just listened? A dangerous idea sparked in my mind, an electric current racing up my back. Passive reception was no longer enough. I needed more than just to listen. I needed to connect, to amplify, to open myself to the source, to become a conduit. I began to sketch out an experimental setup, crude and desperate. It involved jury-rigged components, repurposed frequency generators, and a complex array of biofeedback monitors. I planned to synchronize specific sound frequencies and light pulses with the signal's rhythm to create a resonance within my own neural pathways. The goal was to bridge the gap, to force a direct, unfiltered connection. I knew this could break me, shatter my mind into 1,000 pieces. Hours blurred. My hands, usually steady, shook with a nervous energy as I soldered wires, adjusted dials, and calibrated the makeshift apparatus. The low thrumming of the signal permeated the wires, vibrating the floor beneath my feet, a constant reminder of the immense, unseen presence. It felt like the entire factory was holding its breath, waiting. A phone rang in the distance, but I ignored it. Nothing mattered but this. The isolation intensified, a thick shroud around me. As the setup neared completion, a new, subtle pressure began to build behind my eyes. It wasn't a headache, but a sensation of immense internal expansion, as if my skull was too small to contain the thoughts swirling within. A silent hum resonated in my bones, a deep, sympathetic vibration with the signal. I was almost ready. Could I truly bridge the gap, or would I just open myself to something I couldn't comprehend? The apparatus stood ready, a chaotic tangle of wires, flickering screens, and repurposed electrodes connected to a worn leather strap that would fasten to my forehead. The air tasted metallic, like fear, and something else, something I couldn't place, like stagnant water and ancient stone. My breath hitched in my throat. This was it, the threshold. With a trembling hand, I activated the system. A low, resonant hum filled the room, not from the speakers, but from everywhere at once, vibrating through the concrete floor, up my legs, into my chest. The signal flooded my senses. My mind strained. They spoke of vastness, of slumbering entities, of truths that unraveled the very fabric of my understanding. My identity felt like a fragile thread, pulling apart at the seams. Pain, not physical but existential, tore through me. My knees buckled. I clutched the console, my grip tight, sweat beading on my forehead. What part of me would remain if I pushed through this threshold into the source of the beckoning? And the low hum that had been a distant tremor in the air now resonated deep within my chest. It was no longer an external sound. It was an internal pressure, like my very bones were vibrating loose. The fluorescent tubes overhead in the mechanic shop, my car already on lift, not broken, flickered, not just with their usual faulty hum, but with an accelerated, frantic beat, casting the oily concrete floor in a strobe of sickly yellow and deep shadow. Vision blurred at the edges, the familiar grease stains on the walls seeming to writhe, their dark patterns shifting, reforming into something almost meaningful. The air grew thick, pressing in, making each breath a struggle. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming, unheard frequency. It wasn't just the air vibrating anymore, it was my thoughts. It was a roar in my mind, a deluge of impossible information, bypassing my ears, my eyes, my touch, and going straight to the core of my being. My reality began to fray at the edges. It wasn't a shape, not truly. My mind, straining, tried to impose one, some vast, amorphous blob, but it was more fundamental than that. It was the concept of vastness. I perceived it as a presence, an intelligence that unfolded not in space, but in the very fabric of my understanding. Colors erupted where there should be none, hues that defied the spectrum, shifting and merging into patterns that simultaneously formed and dissolved, like a cosmic tapestry being woven and unraveled at the same impossible instant. It was everything, it was nothing. My knees buckled. I fell, but the concrete floor beneath me wasn't solid. My mind screamed, trying to find purchase, a single stable point of reference, but there was none. Logic crumbled. The world folded in on itself, not physically, but perceptually. The very laws of cause and effect bending and breaking under the weight of this revelation. This was its form. Not a creature, not an entity with limbs or eyes, but a consciousness so utterly alien, so vast, it was the raw, unfiltered idea of existence, sprawling across an expanse I couldn't even begin to measure. And as I drowned in its impossible presence, a terrible understanding began to dawn. Humanity, our history, our aspirations. Our very planet, we were less than dust motes. We were ephemeral flickers, unnoticed, unconsidered. Our reality, the one we clung to with such desperate certainty, was merely a fleeting pattern, a temporary arrangement of cosmic threads. Its purpose wasn't malevolent, not in any way I could comprehend. It simply was, and in its being it was slowly, inevitably reshaping, not destroying but transforming. Like a slow, deliberate breath. It inhaled and exhaled the very fabric of what we knew, twisting it into something new, something that aligned with its own incomprehensible nature. The world I knew, the universe I thought I understood, was merely a brief, accidental ripple on the surface of its eternal, cosmic design. And now I was aware of the ripple. The pressure receded slowly, agonizingly, like a tide pulling back from a devastated shore. The fluorescent lights still hummed, but their frantic flicker had subsided to a dull, familiar buzz. The smell of oil and exhaust returned, grounding me in the mechanic shop, my car already on lift, not broken, but everything was different. My perception was shattered, irrevocably altered. What was left of Raj, the astrophysicist, was a broken vessel filled with an impossible truth. How could I ever look at the stars again without seeing the silent, terrible work of its reshaping? The low hum had burrowed deep, past my ears, past the bone of my skull, settling in my chest like a parasitic heartbeat. It wasn't a sound I heard, but a pressure I felt, vibrating through my ribs, rattling my teeth. The fluorescent tubes overhead in the mechanic shop, my car already on lift, not broken, flickered, not just in their usual tired way, but in erratic, almost violent spasms, plunging the space into near darkness before flaring back with a sickly green intensity. Each flicker sent a jolt through my vision, leaving phantom afterimages that stretched and warped the familiar shapes of tools and car parts. My car, still suspended on the lift, swayed almost imperceptibly with each surge of light, casting a long skeletal shadow that danced across the oil-stained concrete floor. The mechanic, a man whose face I usually remembered as placid and unburdened, stood by a workbench, his back to me. He wasn't working, he was just standing. It was a child's melody, simple and repetitive, but it sounded warped, stretched too thin, like a memory fraying at the edges. My own hands felt clammy, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against the internal hum. "Everything all right?" I managed, my voice a rasp. The mechanic didn't jump, he didn't even turn. His whistling simply ceased, cut off as if by a knife. He slowly rotated his head, not his body, until his eyes met mine over his shoulder. They were wide, unblinking, and held a vacant quality I'd never seen before. A faint tremor ran through him. "It's coming," he murmured, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. "Can't you feel it?" He finally turned fully, and his gaze wasn't vacant anymore. It was filled with a profound, terrifying certainty, as if he saw something in the air around me that I couldn't. What did he see? A sudden, sharp crack echoed from outside, followed by a distant, drawn-out wail that wasn't quite human, not quite animal. It was a sound that seemed to scrape against the inside of my skull, a raw, primal scream of despair. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was maddening. I wanted to run. I needed to get out. The air in the mechanic shop, my car already on lift, not broken, felt too tight, too heavy, like a shroud slowly descending. Was I truly the only one who felt the world shifting? I stumbled backward, away from the rhythmic tapping, away from those knowing eyes. The internal hum intensified, making my vision swim. I had to leave. I pushed through the side door, into the pale, bruised light of late afternoon. The sky above was a canvas of impossible colors, not the familiar blues and oranges of sunset, but bruised purples bleeding into an unsettling chemical green, shot through with veins of incandescent gold. It looked less like sky and more like a vast, bruised eye staring down. People milled about on the street, but their movements were slow, disconnected. A woman pushed a stroller, her head tilted back, staring blankly at the sky, her lips moving in silent incantations. A delivery driver leaned against his van, his eyes wide and unfocused, humming the same child's melody the mechanic had. No one seemed to notice the sky, or if they did, they reacted with a disturbing passivity. My skin prickled. I felt exposed, a raw nerve in a world gone numb. Was this what the signal had wrought? A slow, creeping poison of perception. I started walking, driven by an instinct I couldn't name, a need to witness the extent of this silent invasion. Every step felt heavy, as if gravity itself had intensified. The streetlights flickered on prematurely, casting pools of sickly yellow light that seemed to swallow more than they illuminated. As I moved, I noticed the subtle shifts in the world around me. The murmuring of a nearby fountain sounded like choked sobs. Even the distant traffic hum had taken on a new, unsettling cadence, a low, rhythmic pulse that echoed the hum within my own chest. A street vendor, usually boisterous, stood motionless behind his cart, his eyes fixed on some unseen point in the swirling, unnatural clouds. His wares, bright and colorful just hours ago, now seemed dull, leached of their vibrancy, as if the world's very essence was draining away. It wasn't just wind. It felt like a breath, a vast, unseen exhalation that stirred the leaves and made the flags snap with a violence that felt personal. For a fraction of a second, the familiar urban landscape seemed to waver, its edges blurring, revealing fleeting glimpses of something else beneath impossible geometries, vast, silent spaces that defied comprehension. Had I really seen it, or was it a trick of my overwrought mind, a symptom of the conduit I had become? My throat felt tight, a metallic taste coating my tongue. The faces of the people I passed were all the same now, wide-eyed, vacant, yet holding a terrible shared understanding. They weren't reacting to the strange sky, or the cold wind, or the eerie silence. It was as if a silent agreement had been reached, a horrifying truth acknowledged without a single word. What had they seen or felt that I was only just beginning to grasp?